how it could best address vulnerability. So what all of this means is that I'm hoping to cover quite a bit of ground. With any luck, that should make this a little bit more engaging. It won't let me spend too long on any one part of this. But it also probably means that we'll spend a lot of time on things that you might want to hear a little bit more about. And we should have a little bit more time here today to discuss that. But please, at any point, reach out to me. I'm more than happy to talk about pretty much anything to do with trust research. It's about 90% of what happens in my brain. Not to say that that's actually successful by any means, but it is really what I'm spending most of my time thinking about. So, did that work? Perfect. So why should we care about vulnerability when we're thinking about trust? The short answer is that it's pretty widely recognized as being one of the really important parts of the trust puzzle. But it's also a pretty tough contender for being the part of trust research that we collectively spend the least amount of time really thinking about or developing. Now, there's certainly a fair amount of disagreement as to what trust itself actually is. But for the most part, it seems that most of us really adopt a definition that's akin to the Layer and colleagues 95 definition. And my own tweak on that definition should be on the slide here. But like all of the definitions that come out of that AMR piece, they really highlight two things. One is that in contrast to those who define trust as a behavior, trust is a psychological state, and it's one that is distinct from, but that facilitates a willingness, that facilitates risky cooperative behavior. But the other piece of this is really focused on the nature of what that willingness is, and that is that it is a willingness to accept vulnerability. And to date, most trust research is really focused on the willingness part of this, and especially on trying to understand what it takes to facilitate a willingness to be vulnerable. So the first arguments really focus on the personality of the truster, such that trust was generally thought to exist when the truster is a trusting person. Later, the field kind of moved to highlight the characteristics of the trustee that make them appear worthy of being trusted. And there's a lot of different trustworthiness dimensions that have been explored in the literature, but there's good reason to think that ability, benevolence, and integrity really do capture most of that variance. As I mentioned, though, where the literature tends to spend a bit less time is on the other piece of what this psychological state is. So while we have an increasingly good idea of what makes us willing to accept it, we know a lot less about what makes different vulnerabilities different, and then whether and how those differences change the nature of trust. So if you take, for example, the picture here, it's pretty clear. We have a truster and a trustee that are engaged in some kind of finding activity. But I'd also argue that it's pretty clear who's who. You're able to see it around.
Yeah. Just was wondering whether he or she actually has a foot on the rock.
No, yeah. But I argue it's clear who's who, right? That one of these people is clearly at risk of experiencing some kind of harm that is controlled by the other person, who we call our trustee. So the person on the left is most clearly vulnerable to the one at the top right. We then say that trust exists if our truster feels comfortable with the trustee's control over it. Sorry. If the truster feels comfortable with that trustee's control over their potential injury. And as we just discussed, the literature offers all kinds of reasons why they might. They might just be a trusting person. They might know enough or think that they know enough about the other person to feel that they're worthy of being trusted. And as a little bit of a side point that's been really interesting, at least in my mind lately, we might be in a situation where this truster has no choice but to accept the help of this particular trustee, but wanting to avoid the mental distress of feeling distrust, they actually effortfully choose to trust instead. Where we're a little bit less developed, though, in our thinking about all of this, is how that vulnerability might change given different conditions, and then why that matters for trust. So looking at the picture here, we can't see how far the drop is. So there's room for some variability in terms of in the objective level of harm, such that if that trustee violates trust, the consequence could be a short drop, or it could be certain death. There's also room for variability in terms of how this truster would experience this sense of vulnerability, such that they may be more or less concerned about heights, and a greater or lesser fear of heights. And it's also possible that our truster may have more or less capacity to actually control their potential for injury after a trust violation if, for example, the bag on their back here is a parachute. Now, others have argued that variability and vulnerability should at least change the amount of trust that's needed to get to cooperative behavior. That's the classic Mayer argument. But it also seems that it could change the process of trust, such that we might not be all that interested in a particular type of trustworthiness when our vulnerability is really not that severe. As it becomes more severe, though, we might be more interested in very specific trustworthiness dimensions, or it may simply be that we want more evidence of more dimensions of trustworthiness in order to get to trust. To date, though, most of our scholarly treatment of the construct is pretty superficial. I mean, we absolutely recognize that trusting the police is different than trusting the boss or trusting the babysitter, but we don't usually go a whole lot further than that. So what do we actually know about vulnerability? Well, if you look in the trust literature, or step outside of the trust literature, but also a little bit within it, it actually turns out we know quite a bit. And there's two pieces of this that I think are really important for this conversation about vulnerability. And these are things that other people have connected to trust, so they just want to draw them out as being from other areas. And the first is the argument that vulnerability is a harm that's a fundamental part of the human experience. I mean, the reality is that in general, we can't provide for everything that we need. Even when people try to remove themselves entirely from society, they're usually somewhat limited in their ability to achieve their highest potential. And cooperation usually allows us to achieve more. But in so doing, we both create and we intensify our interconnectedness and thus our interdependence. And that leads to a second reality of the human experience, which is that we can't fully predict each other's behavior. We simply can't know for sure that any given other person won't make a choice that either prevents us from getting the same benefit or that causes us some injury. And that leads to the third point here, which is simply that harm then matters. We can't simply reverse or undo harm once it's been experienced. The other important thing, though, that we know pretty definitively is that how people think about risk varies quite a bit. So as we might expect, the research suggests that different people feel very differently about risk as a function of that context. So most of the people here, I would assume, probably feel fairly differently about cell phone radiation versus nuclear weapons or about forest fires. But there's also quite a bit of variability, even within specific domains. One of the most settled findings in the risk perception literature is that experts and the public tend to think very differently about risk from the same harm. But there are also pretty reliable differences by race, by gender, and by age, such that older white males tend to feel the least risk, or tend to perceive the least risk. So if you'll indulge me the hypothetical, and to my lab, I apologize because I do this with them all the time. I often try and make these issues a little bit more concrete by asking people to think about stepping into an elevator. Now, whether or not you think about it, when you step into an elevator with someone, you are interdependent. Now, it's not an especially cooperative behavior, so it's not that you could achieve more by cooperating with them. But what you have done is put yourself in a confined space with someone else who can make decisions that you can't fully predict or control. They could assault you, they could treat you rudely, especially timely. They could make any number of a series of bad decisions that might increase your odds of contracting COVID. Now, recognizing that vulnerability, most of our societies have identified some kinds of institutions or have created a series of institutions that really have the pretty explicit goal of trying to deal with at least the worst of these vulnerabilities. And in so many ways, this is exactly why we have the police, why we have tort law, why we have public health regulations. But even with them, we still can't fully predict or control what an elevator mate is going to do. And if they cause us injury, that is simply going to matter. Even so, not all of us are going to feel the same way about that vulnerability. So some people are just generally trusting, and so they never even consider that potential for injury. Some people are immunocompromised and are constantly thinking about being exposed to COVID, and especially in the US, some people carry weapons specifically not to feel vulnerable in situations like that. So, assuming I've at least posed an intriguing argument about why vulnerability might matter for trust, I want to change gears a little bit and present a series of now published papers that explore vulnerability in the policing context. Now, the overarching idea here was to introduce the US-centered policing literature to the idea of trust, or to a version of trust that really accepted or centered this idea of vulnerability as a central construct. And the majority of that research, again, at least in the US, really focuses on legitimacy as its central construct, really pulls from legitimacy theory. And trust is often discussed in that literature. It's never especially well defined, and it's often treated as interchangeable with trustworthiness or with satisfaction or with some of the other constructs they look at there. We argue, though, that trust is different specifically because of its relationship to vulnerability. So in the first paper, we integrated trust conceptualized as this willingness to accept vulnerability into the classic model of police legitimacy to basically figure out whether or not it will work. And in the second paper, we leveraged the psychometric paradigm of risk to explore the vulnerabilities that the public feels toward the police, and then to try and test whether that variability in those assessments was at all systematic. And then in the final paper, we explored whether changing the type of interaction that participants had with the police would change the kinds of things they most wanted in the officer they were interacting with. So, as I mentioned, the idea for the first paper was to position this more nuanced conceptualization of trust against the classic model of legitimacy. Basically, that model argues that experiences of procedural justice lead the public to evaluate the police as a legitimate authority, and that in turn leads to cooperation. And after playing a little bit with a few different theories, and to an extent with the data itself, we really broadened each of these out to restate this process just a little bit more generally. So we argue that positive evaluations of the police or experiences with the police, which include experiencing procedural justice, lead to positive evaluations of the police. And this includes things like normative alignment and some of the more concrete measures of legitimacy that do exist out there. And that then leads to cooperative outcomes. And we integrated trust by arguing that as this psychological state of a willingness to accept vulnerability, it really should come between the evaluations of the police and then mediate their relationship with outcomes or with cooperation afterwards. So we drafted a measure of this vulnerability forward conceptualization of trust, and then asked an online national convenience sample of individuals that we recruited via MTurk to complete a survey from which we tested our model. And we did find that trust fully mediated the relation between evaluations of the police and cooperation. Now, I do need to caution here, because we're talking about cause and we're talking about mediation in a single data set that's been collected as cross-sectional data. But we do find really good consistency between the theory and the data, which we take as at least a starting point for this argument that it might make sense to think about trust as conceptualized as a willingness to accept vulnerability. So assuming that we're right, a potentially profitable next step would be to explore the nature of that vulnerability. And given that different people are going to think differently about it, to test whether specific elements of that variability then actually matter. And one option would be to approach this qualitatively and just ask people how they feel vulnerable to the police. But we actually took a more deductive-based approach and used some literature coming out of what's called the psychometric paradigm of risk. And basically what that paradigm argues is that a relatively limited number of dimensions do a pretty good job of explaining why people feel differently about the harm that comes from different hazards. Now, I will say that more recent developments in this literature do collapse these quite a bit further than we did, but we really wanted to capture this variability, to capture as many of these dimensions as we could to see if any of them are different across people. So we asked our participants to report the extent to which they feel that the harm caused by the police is a consequence of choices that people make, whether the effects of that harm are immediate or delayed, whether the participant themselves and people in power know about that harm, whether people can control their exposure to the police and thus their chance of being hurt in the first place, whether that harm affects one person or many, whether they fear the harm, and then whether they felt that the harm itself was severe. And data from this study were again collected from another online national convenience sample, but this time we used Qualtrics quotas because we had the goal of making sure that our sample was made up of 1/3 white, 1/3 black, and then 1/3 Muslim US citizens. And we picked those groups specifically because there's research to suggest they have very different experiences with law enforcement. Now, comparing across race, we perhaps unsurprisingly find that our Black participants were more concerned, but they weren't different on all of the dimensions. And they reported statistically equivalent means for the extent to which they felt that people in power know about the harm the police cause. Across religion, our Muslim participants again reported the greatest concern, but interestingly, their responses were much more similar to non-religious participants, such that both Muslim and non-religious participants perceived more risk or more stronger vulnerability than did our Christian participants. Again, though, these differences weren't identified on all of the dimensions, as all three of our religious affiliations reported statistically equivalent means in the extent to which they know, the extent to which people in power know, and the extent to which, or the breadth of the impact of police-caused harm. So then to understand the extent to which these differences in vulnerability actually matter, we regressed that measure of a willingness to accept vulnerability from the first paper on the 8 psychometric paradigm dimensions with a few theoretically relevant controls, so trustworthiness, propensity to trust, cynicism towards the law was also one of them, and we had a measure of fear of crime that was also a control in that model. And unsurprisingly, trustworthiness is by far the biggest predictor of trust. But the extent to which our participants felt that the police caused harm was immediately felt and that they can control their exposure to the police were both independently predictive. So, having established that measures of trust as a willingness to accept vulnerability work in the policing context, and that differences that we would expect across racial and religious groups are in fact reflected on some, but not all of the dimensions of the psychometric paradigm, and that differences in a couple of them then actually correspond with differences in the level of trust, we next flip the question to ask whether people in different situations would want different things from the police. So to that end, we asked participants to imagine themselves interacting with a police officer in 4 different scenarios that varied in terms of their severity and their concreteness, and specifically of what we argue to be the most salient police-caused harm. So in the speeding scenario, we asked them to assume that they've been driving faster than the speed limit, coming home from work, and had been pulled over. So in this situation, the police-controlled harm that should be most salient really should be the potential for receiving a citation. But we argue that this is less severe because this is a relatively low-level punishment, and in this case, it would be something that was reserved. We contrasted that, though, in the misidentified scenario by asking people to assume that they've been wrongly stopped and questioned as a suspect in a crime that they had not committed. So in both of these situations, the police are positioned to make decisions that impact the vulnerability of the participant to harms that would then vary in terms of their severity. So contrasting this deserved ticket with an undeserved arrest. But both of these are going to be relatively concrete. In the lower part of the diagram, though, we focus on these more amorphous injuries, specifically the feeling of security that we often expect in our lives. So in the patrol scenario, we ask participants to think about the officer that is assigned to patrol their neighborhood, and so the one who's going to be most connected to their day-to-day safety. Then in the victim scenario, we ask them to consider interacting with an officer after experiencing a break-in. Now, in both of these cases, the police-controlled harm is really going to be about the ability to foster or the failures of foster this feeling of security after experiencing a break-in or just living in the neighborhood. But we argued that that vulnerability should be more severe when they were a victim of a recent crime. Now, before we get too far into this, I want to make it clear that we're talking here about the ostensibly, the most salient vulnerability that this person is ostensibly vulnerable to. An important goal of this paper was to provide practical guidance to law enforcement by helping them understand what kinds of things people might want from them in various common scenarios. And that really forced us to take an objective lens, because you can't really expect an officer to subjectively evaluate how someone may feel in a given situation. But as I mentioned, risk is inherently subjective. And so there's every reason to believe that different people will enter these different scenarios with different thoughts about their vulnerability there. Nonetheless, though, this did still give us an opportunity to test whether these ostensibly different vulnerabilities actually precipitated different kinds of trustworthiness that people wanted. So all of our participants saw all 4 of the scenarios in random order. And then we randomly assigned them to report the dimensions of either procedural justice or of trustworthiness that they most wanted in that specific officer. And I have a feeling there's no way we'll be able to see this, but across scenarios, our participants tended to emphasize a willingness to listen and ability. But counter to our expectations, there really aren't many differences by scenario. That pattern holds pretty much across every one of these situations. Now, we did find a slightly increased emphasis on a willingness to listen when the situation is more severe, And we find that integrity becomes even less important in the amorphous scenarios. But again, we're really not seeing the major changes that we were expecting. So while this does provide some evidence of the trust antecedents that people are most looking for in various situations where they interact with law enforcement, we really don't see clear changes in priorities as a function of that vulnerability, which might suggest that situations really don't change as much as we might think that they would. Now, as I noted, some of this could have been just because we're talking here about what we argued to be the most salient vulnerability, and we could have just been wrong. We didn't ask participants how they actually feel about the risk in each of these situations, and it would certainly make sense if that subjective evaluation is really what moderates these relationships. So, in thinking across all three of these studies, we provide some certainly imperfect evidence that it makes some sense to think of trust as a willingness to accept vulnerabilities to the police. That different people will think differently about some, but not about all, of the dimensions of the psychometric paradigm as applied to that vulnerability. And that some, but again, not all of those elements then predict levels of trust. We, however, don't find that people that we are expecting to experience different vulnerabilities because of different situations are looking for especially different things when they set their trust. So in terms of projects that are currently in progress, pretty much everything that we're doing right now in the Trust Lab addresses some element of this trust and vulnerability nexus. And I have a feeling it's because I talked way too much about vulnerability in lab and just kind of imparted that on. But it's a little bit of background for the lab itself. We started in 2020 with the goal of creating a collaborative and interdisciplinary environment for student-led trust research. And that lab is open to students from across campus and currently has 7 students and 1 undergrad that are representing criminal justice, psychology, and social work. And the students are tasked with proposing and then leading a research project that both advances the theory of trust and has real-world implications. And the idea is to use the lab to collaboratively support those projects. So students are encouraged to use the lab time however best serves their project, which usually means that they kind of present their current thinking and where they are in the project for collective feedback. But we've also used the lab to pilot instruments. We've used it to discuss and to some extent actually conduct some analyses. And then to strategize how best to approach writing. And everyone is expected to contribute to those projects in the lab meeting, but most of these projects usually then find a smaller team that work more closely outside of lab to really keep the project moving. And we use an opt-out model for co-authorship. So everyone's invited, or everyone has the opportunity to opt out of working on each of the papers, but we keep the project lead with the final say in terms of authorship. So the 3 projects that are listed here are the most developed, and they kind of help show the diversity of the foci and the stuff we're working on. So Jenna is leading the first, and that uses representative data collected by another group that is on campus to look at the interplay of trust and vulnerability to COVID specifically as competing predictors of a willingness to engage in contract tracing for liberals versus conservatives. John is then leading the second, which uses MTRK data to understand what vulnerabilities the public feels toward the courts when engaging with them for dispute resolution, and specifically whether there are differences in the vulnerabilities that they feel as a function of whether that is an online, informal, or formal resolution process. And then Amanda is leading the third, which uses data that we collected from a survey we fielded with MSU students, where we asked them what harms they feel vulnerable to regarding their university, and then specifically what level of the university was responsible for each of them. Now, by happenstance, we actually fielded that survey around the start of the fall semester in 2020. And so as you can probably imagine, a lot of the harms that students reported had something to do with how the university was managing COVID. And because of the practical implications of that data, Amanda led a brief report that addresses just those COVID-specific harms that we actually just finished. Now, in general, there isn't a requirement for both doing a report and a paper unless we're working directly with an agency that requires that report as well. The students often do elect to produce these short summaries of their research findings that we then publish on the lab website. And as a side point, the reason for the second S in the Trust Lab is so that I could be sure that I would get the website. I figured no one else would use it. So coming back to the point here, what does all of this have to say about how future trust research might most profitably engage with vulnerability? Well, it's most general. The clearest piece of advice that I could offer to trust research is that we should probably do a little bit more to contextualize our work against the specific vulnerability that our participants feel. And most strong trust research already starts with some kind of a conversation about the relationship between the truster and the trustee that allows some kind of a window into the vulnerability they're likely to feel. But it would only help for us to understand how our specific samples and the populations they're supposed to speak to actually feel about their vulnerability. And in the interest of decolonializing our work, to think about how those changes, how those vulnerabilities might change as a function of diversity, of equity, of inclusion type issues. But this is pretty general advice, and it really doesn't address what specific vulnerability you are looking for or what about that vulnerability you really need to know. So when we think about most relationships, there's a few kinds of harm that we're vulnerable to. And we would argue, though, that the vulnerability that's most relevant for trust is specifically that truster's vulnerability to harm rooted in the agency of the trustee. So what does that actually mean? Well, if you think back to that picture from the second slide, which I hope now you can see maybe a little better, it's on this side or something. We would argue that when this truster feels trust, the vulnerability they're willing to accept is the vulnerability they feel, and not necessarily the risk they're objectively facing. So even though we might look at the scene and say that it's objectively clear that this fall is way too small to matter, what matters is not what we can see from the outside, but what that truster feels. And it's not their perceived vulnerability to all harm either. So when that truster is willing to accept vulnerability to that trustee, they're not necessarily willing to accept their vulnerability to what someone else might do or the injury that they might experience during an earthquake. We would argue that vulnerability, as it applies to trust, is specific to the harm that the specific trustee is believed to control. So then what about that vulnerability matters? Is it that it's physical versus psychological, or that it's permanent versus temporary? And there's a lot of reasons why different vulnerabilities are experienced differently. And if all of those dimensions matter, it really doesn't help us a whole lot, because it would just suggest that vulnerability is just idiosyncratic and that people are going to feel differently in different situations. If you really think about it, that's the assumption that underpins most trust research. We know that different contexts are different, but we usually just assume that it's just that they would be different. We argue, though, that there's three key dimensions of that vulnerability that do the bulk of the work in helping us understand the construct in most situations. So for those of you who are comfortable reading conceptual diagrams, this is usually how we talk about trust. Like I mentioned from the start, we usually assume that a truster's propensity to trust and their perceived trustworthiness of the trustee are going to drive that willingness to accept vulnerability that is trust itself, and then that facilitates cooperation. Our theory, though, adds three dimensions of that vulnerability that the truster is or is not willing to accept. Namely, its severity, its asymmetry, and its inevitability. So severity assesses the extent to which the truster cares about the harm they're vulnerable to. So if our truster is really worried about falling, perhaps because of that fear of heights, we would say that that vulnerability is more severe. If, though, they're used to climbing and really don't feel that this particular fall is all that important, we would say that that's a less severe vulnerability. Asymmetry then refers to the balance of that severity as experienced by the truster and the trustee. So if our truster feels that the trustee can drop them without any consequence, that would be an asymmetric vulnerability. But if the truster feels that if the trustee were to violate that trust, they would be devastated or potentially even arrested, that starts to become a bit more symmetrical. And finally, inevitability refers to the extent to which the harm that the truster is vulnerable to is inevitable after a trust violation. So if, for example, our truster is wearing that parachute, there's quite a bit that they can still do to avoid injury after their trust is violated. The next part of our argument addresses how those different vulnerabilities impact trust. So we argue that severity has a direct effect on trust, such that the more severe a vulnerability is, the less trust the truster will feel. And that effect is moderated by both asymmetry and inevitability, such that when that vulnerability is more symmetrical, there's more pressure on the trustee to not violate trust, and that really washes out some of the impact of that severity. Similarly, we argue that when the injury is not inevitable after a trust violation, the truster's continued control over the injury they experience also helps to diffuse that severity. And before I stop, I want to quickly recognize all of the people and all of the groups that have been such a critical part in developing these ideas. I'm deeply indebted to all of my co-authors, to the various units that have either hosted me or provided feedback on this work, to the Trust Lab, which has been a great opportunity to really develop these ideas, and to all of you, both for your attention this evening, but also for your thoughts in pushing this work in our following conversation. I do love talking. I haven't quite had to do it yet, but I do love
Yes, thank you so much, Joe. And yes, maybe the online audience was a bit shocked that we all knocked with our fists on the table, but that's how we do applause in Germany. And I don't know if Zoom is ever going to have a knocking your fist on the table function. But so, Joe, thank you for sharing the study results and also the kind of nascent model at the end, because I know we're still discussing a lot about it. And I would have, of course, a few questions myself, but I don't want to take the floor here. I'm just going to share now, and my task is to look in here in the room who would like to ask a question, but at the same time keep an eye on the online audience. And for those of you online, please use the raise hand function, and then it'll show up in my participant list. And we have the first online contributor here. So Michael, just a moment. I'll also want to check here in the room. Is there already list some speakers? So yeah, wonderful. We have a few people in the room who definitely want to ask a question as well. Mark Saunders is now on the list too, so that's great. But let's start with Michael, and so that we can also check that the sound works properly. So first question, Michael or Michael, rather, the floor is yours.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Thanks for the really nice talk, Joe, and the great work sharing. Yeah, so I have one question, and it has to do with something that, yeah, Annette Bayer already brought forward, and also actually Professor Mullering, and I'm actually going to quote him, where it was said that it might be that many processes, trust processes, will stop as soon as minor doubts or disturbances occur to one's in one's mind. So I was wondering if how you exclude if vulnerability, if the experience of vulnerability before you do the cooperation, if this is not actually hindering the making the leap to trust, and how you will because now it almost seems that vulnerability is gonna explain or I don't know, but I was wondering if the reverse is not more often so, because if I feel vulnerable and I'm knowledgeable of it, then I feel afraid, and the fear stops me from maybe going into it. So I was wondering what you can say about this.
One, that it's a very good question, and one that I could not speak to empirically. But the assumption that we are making as we approach this idea of vulnerability being something before trust makes at least the assumption that people have to be able to access something about their vulnerability or the interdependence with the other person. And so I do think that it makes total sense that if that interdependence or that vulnerability specifically is too strong and is too big a deal, and you are really worried, then you would see that unwillingness to accept vulnerability, that they wouldn't be willing to accept it because the risk is simply too big. What I can say from the work that we have done is that most people, not all of them, but most of the participants that we have collected data from, where we've asked them kind of just to describe their vulnerability to something like the police, most of them can identify something. Most of them can identify some way that they are vulnerable to something that the police could decide to do. And there's variability within that group of people in terms of how much trust they report. And so it isn't the case that if people feel any vulnerability, they can't report that they also trust. But it does make complete sense that there's going to be some group of people that will report they do trust and they don't feel terribly vulnerable. And there will be people that feel incredibly vulnerable and so don't trust. And sorting all of that out sounds like a project I'd really like to be involved in. So if you have ideas, I would love to give me feedback on it. But I think you hit an excellent point there.
Thank you, Joe. Let's have the next question here from the room. Maybe Thomas? Yes, please. Yeah. And so your microphone is also in there. So
okay, yeah. Thanks for your presentation. I have a question related to the final model.
Okay.
You said the determinants of the willingness to accept vulnerability, sorry, there are certain words you should never say in English, vulnerability, are the characteristics of the trustee and the truster in the end. What about the characteristics of the relationship between these two? Because when I look at trust, I always think about like episodes. I have an initial idea about whether I can trust this person or whether I am vulnerable by this person.
Yeah.
And then after the transaction, I assess whether I could trust, whether it was reciprocated or not.
Yeah.
And then I assess the situation another time for the next episode of this relationship.
Yes.
So depending on if they just meet or if they work together or whatever, do together for a longer period of time, it may be significantly different. So
Sure.
how does the relationship come into this model?
Your question betrays a bias of mine in this, which is that I do tend to move from this very cross-sectional snapshot of a relationship approach that's really heavily driven by the public opinion side of trust research. This idea that at any given moment, you can take a snapshot of a relationship and understand the level of trust that person feels, which doesn't do a lot to really understand the dynamics of that relationship and how it might change over time, even when it's longitudinally collected. There's a bit of something missing there that, and not knowing your work specifically, but especially in a qualitative sense, you can really pull out those kinds of contexts with the relationship. So the short answer to your question is that in the model, as I have tested it in the past, it boils into those two things. That if this is a relationship where the person feels that they've been hurt a lot in the past, this has been a terrible relationship, they really don't care about me, you'd see that in variability and benevolence. If they've lied in the past, you'd see that in variability and integrity. But it isn't a very satisfying answer, because there is more to the fact that there is the vulnerability the vulnerability they feel will change as the relationship progresses and depending on what happens in that relationship. And I would distinguish there between what we're calling initial vulnerability and added vulnerability, because it really is about going into this assessment of a relationship when you choose to trust and not about what happens after it, but it's going to be a cyclical process. And so with any luck, the snapshot will work, but it is that it has to continue being taken. That hopefully all of those experiences you're talking about do feed into the antecedents we're looking at. But I'm guessing from the way that you phrased the question, that's not an entirely satisfying answer.
But at least I understand. So it is just snapshot at one point in time, and there would be the same model with different characteristics at a later point in time as the relationship progresses, right?
Yeah. And you might hope that there'd be some moderation, right? That some things become a lot more important. We tried in graduate school as a graduate student on the project to make the argument that the propensity to trust should be most predictive when people know the least, and that you should start to see more predictive relationships from trustworthiness or things out of the relationship later. And it sort of worked. It didn't, but again, this is taking that snapshot model versus that whole relationship focused one.
And I think that in the model at the end, the asymmetry and inevitability also are somewhat relational conditions here. They at least, but they're also subjective, like from the how asymmetric or inevitable do you see your vulnerability towards the other? But I think it's very important that the vulnerability is really seen as a relational construct and but perceived individually. So that's the kind of challenge. Yeah. Mark, would you like to go next?
Thanks, Guido, and hello everybody. It's good to see folks, and it's wonderful to be talking. Thank you, Guido, for organising. Thank you, Joseph, also for the presentation, which it got me thinking, which is always, I think, a sign of a great presentation. I'd like to sort of go back to your talk when you started talking about procedural justice and trustworthiness and your thoughts behind that. In particular, not only why you chose to look at procedural justice, but also, had you considered looking at, say, interactional justice, where the research has shown that this tends to have a stronger impact on people's trusting?
So in the study, the studies that we have done, I don't think we've ever measured interactional justice. And the simplest answer to that is that not everyone that we are, especially in this policing context, not everyone that we're collecting data from actually has an interaction to think of. That being said, that would be a piece of what we would expect to go into those experiences with the those evaluations of the police themselves, the positive experiences. And so one of the arguments we make in that first paper is that we should stop talking about legitimacy in particular as being very specific individual constructs, and that it should be considered more of a process. And that really what we're talking about is a lot of different things that go into positive experiences, including interactional justice, that drive a few different ways that you can look at these evaluations that then create this internalized willingness to accept vulnerability. So no, we personally haven't looked at the construct, but it should fit within the model we're proposing, or that framework we propose in that paper.
Yeah, I could see it could fit in the framework quite well. And I was thinking in particular, it fits if you split it into its interpersonal and informational aspects. It then sort of starts to perhaps answer your concern of not being directly involved with, because you're still receiving the informational aspects, even if you're not directly involved.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so I think back to the room. Next question, please.
Thanks a lot for the insights, and particularly I really like the example, like explaining with the police. And my question is that, do you think that public institutions, or like for instance, the police station, are aware of the vulnerability of the citizens? And if yes, are they taking any measures in order to work on their trustworthiness? And if not, have you been approached by them before to work on this specific topic?
So I'm gonna have to take the researcher hat off for a second, and the social justice person one is gonna go on for a second. I feel that that is one of the central problems in the relationship that the police are trying to build with the public, is that they're often addressing the wrong vulnerability. So when, in speaking somewhat anecdotally, but somewhat from the literature, when police think about their job, they tend to think about it in terms of preventing crime. They tend to think about it in terms of being strong and creating a change, not creating a change, but preventing the crime that someone might experience and protecting from getting in the way of the bad guys. Where that may be what some people are hoping for from the police, but the idea that the police would be a negative force in society is a very common vulnerability. This idea that individuals themselves would be hurt is a very common vulnerability. And what you often see after something like one of the higher profile policing cases, you often see the police saying, if they weren't committing a crime, we wouldn't have engaged with them in the first place. Like, if we are doing our job of protecting you from crime, and they neglect the part where after they engage with the person, their behavior is probably less defensible at that point. Because the vulnerable people are not people in general. The people that I'm speaking about right now in terms of this vulnerability to the police and being a negative force in society, their concern is not whether or not you interact with criminals. It's what you do with the criminal after you interact with them. And I hear people talking past each other all the time on that. The police say, no, but we're doing what we're supposed to do. And they say, but you didn't after you interacted with them. In terms of interacting with public agencies, we, with any luck, we submitted a grant proposal a little while ago. For right now, it seems like maybe it might be funded, but the centerpiece of that is working with a public health agency to try and actually extract the vulnerabilities that the community specifically feel, and then help them develop community engagement strategies that focus on them. So they're actually saying to them, what is it that you are vulnerable to with us, and how exactly can we do something about that? One of our big hypotheses there is that public health agencies are often very focused on preventing illness, or keeping illness low, but they may be less focused on addressing things like systemic racism. And especially coming out of somewhere like Michigan with something like Flint, this idea that a public health agency could either neglect or advance systemic racism may be a really important vulnerability for some of these communities. So again, with any luck, that'll be funded. And if it is, that's the whole point, is to try and help them redevelop those strategies.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. Fingers crossed, of course, that it will work out. And I think we'll continue the ping pong between online and offline. And so Ferenc is up next, please.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, thank you. So I'm Ferenc Murica. I work for the Hungarian Central Statistical Office Methodology Department, and I've just defended my PhD in conceptual trust research. And I find your presentation very interesting and of very high quality. So thank you very much for that. And even though I have quite some comments, which I will try to cut very short, I wanted to make this known that this is an exceptional quality presentation on this topic and on this problem. I especially liked the model you presented in the end with the asymmetry, severity, and inevitability of vulnerability. So I have some questions and some comments, which if you don't mind, I would like to present you in like together. If I understood you correctly, you started from an established concept of trust. This quite widespread concept of definition of the willingness to accept vulnerability. And I would be very interested in understanding why you accepted this particular definition, because there are quite some definitions out there, and this is one of them. This is a quite elaborate one, and I know in some fields this is like the standard definition, but in other fields it might not be that obvious to choose this one. A second question might be that I might not have understood you well enough, because I had some problems with the quality of the sound here on my end. So I didn't exactly understand what were you arguing against, because I didn't see any alternatives to this definition, to this concept you were starting with. So you elaborated on it quite well, I might say, based on the results. But I like, it seemed to me, it appeared to me that you were arguing against something, defending this particular definition against something, but I didn't hear, or I didn't catch the critiques which you were arguing against. Which there are quite some, if I may add. And another question might be, if you are familiar with the non-cognitive conceptions of trust, of the trust concept, which are a little bit different. As actually, this vulnerability notion comes from Annette Bayer's work, this accepted vulnerability, and Maya and colleagues picked it up, of course, or have come to the same conclusion in like unrelated to Annette Bayer's. But there is an established critique on this accepted vulnerability aspect or approach in other literature within the non-cognitive school. Most importantly, Lagerschwetz and Herzberg, that you might have heard about, and they assume that in this accepted vulnerability, and this is the key, in this accepted vulnerability definition, there is an inherent assumption that vulnerability would something that we avoid. And here is the tables turned by them, that vulnerability is not always something we would avoid, and we would not just reluctantly accept it as a given in the situation if we trust. Yeah, I know. I will cut it short. Sorry. So these were the questions, and of course, one further thing I would like to mention here is that vulnerability as a problem is very deeply rooted in in the existential issue of non-being, and there's a very rich literature about that. And I would be really interested on your take on this. And I'm extremely sorry that I had so much comments and questions, but it was a very, very good and very thought-provoking presentation. Thank you so much.
Okay, this was a lot, Joe.
We'll see if I can do
Your
it.
answer is shorter than the question.
Yeah, no, for sure. One, would love to talk about time offline. It sounds like there's a lot that we could talk about here. But to quickly answer your questions, the MDS model that we really focused on, and the definition that comes from that, is one that we wanted to tweak a little bit, but we did kind of take it. It was something that I found as I was trying to get my hands around what trust is. It's something that I found that made a lot of sense to me. And so when you say that it sounds like I was arguing against something, I think what you're hearing is the grad student be still trying to argue against trust is just something, and trying to argue that it could be something very specific. There are other approaches you can take, but I have very much, I don't know, I've very much attached myself to this one for whatever reason. I can talk more about that if that helps. To your question about vulnerability as being a bad thing always. Without having read more of the critiques, it's hard just to speak to exactly how this might answer them, but at least in my own mind, the idea that we as humans want predictability and control, and that when we don't have it, that is a psychologically aversive state, really underpins my assumption that that if we could be hurt and that hurt could matter a lot to us, we're not happy in that space. And so that's really where I come from when I make the argument that we're trying to address vulnerability. But again, I'd love to talk offline.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joe. And Geoffrey Hosking, it's very nice to see you online. Maybe your hand is up. Please, we'll take the next one from you.
Can you hear me? I sent it to you in writing so that it'd be easy, but I'll speak in any case. Many people in the modern world feel very vulnerable to the operations of the global economy. They react by putting their trust in populist politicians who are not actually very trustworthy. Why is this, do you think?
Good question.
We've been knocking this around a lot, right?
Yeah.
Is it really trust? But yeah, over to you, Joe. It's yours.
What I want to say as a knee-jerk response, and risking that I'm making it sound like I'm answering the question everyone would like to have answered right now. The idea that we are vulnerable to something outside of a relationship could make us want to accept a different vulnerability within that relationship. That falls apart a little bit if you think about these populist politicians as being in control of the economy, because then it really is a vulnerability to decisions that they will make. But when you think about things like an increased threat from corona or an increased threat from crime, and those driving us into trusting relationships, I'd argue that what's happening there is that there's a threat from outside the relationship that makes an internal threat within the relationship much more acceptable. And it's really just a motivated process.
Okay, thank you.
Now, what do you think, Geoffrey?
Well, what I think is that people don't trust the international economy because we can see international financial institutions making huge profits, often at our expense. So the gain in the international economy is all for international institutions, but our only defense against them are national institutions who pay us, social security if we get into trouble, who provide education services and so on and so forth. And they're being made more and more poverty-stricken by the operations of the international economy. So that would be you can put trust in something, and populist politicians emphasize, first of all, the greatness of your nation, and secondly, they want usually actually to reform and strengthen social security systems at the national level. So we've got an operation on two levels, and people feel very vulnerable to one level, but persuade themselves that they can trust the nation personified in this political figure.
That compensatory process makes a lot of sense to me. Okay.
Good, thank you.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. Now back here in the room, Leona, please.
Yeah, Joe, thanks for this presentation. Very nice. Actually, I was a little bit struck, and I have a question around the last model that you proposed. So I was not struck by the entire model, but by one particular aspect that I wanted to ask you about.
Sure.
I think you call it severity of vulnerability. It sounds a little bit paradoxical to me, because I feel like whenever we're vulnerable, it's already a severe situation, right? Of course, maybe it's different when we're kind of dangling from a cliff or at the dentist, but nevertheless, I still feel like vulnerability is always in a way quite severe, and I was wondering how you think about that.
I'm afraid my answer is only going to be semantic, and that is that when it sounds like when you're talking about vulnerability, you're talking about the heightened specific experience of feeling vulnerable. Where I think we're a little bit more focused on the breadth of the idea of vulnerability. It's difficult, so I'm not by any means going to pretend like I have the answer to this, but it should be possible for someone who is in a relationship in which there is vulnerability, for them to not ever really think about it, to not ever really consider that. If they can't identify a vulnerability at all, we've probably gone too far. If they really don't think there's anything that could go wrong. But what I'm referring to when I refer to vulnerability is not just that severe, intense, personal, like I feel very vulnerable, and is more just this opportunity to be hurt that's controlled by someone else. So if it's someone you trust and you never think about the fact they could hurt you, that doesn't mean you're not vulnerable, but it would mean you wouldn't be in the severe state that you're talking about.
But if I may add, we're really trying to find categories here for developing the dimensions of vulnerability without slipping into like the risk management logic of like size of the loss times probability and so on. And at the same time also capturing the emotional part and how people feel about their vulnerability. And so I think when you say, Leona, that when people are vulnerable, it's always severe, but we still think that they can be more or less severe, or that's at least what we're trying to develop. And maybe we're trying to capture too much with the severity, because we also try to capture that, for example, the material loss objectively may be low, but the emotional loss may be severe, and then we would say the severity is high if you know you were emotionally attached to an item that you might lose because the other one damages it and things like that. So I think severity is trying to capture just a lot, but I think it has to be in there in this kind of. You can't say it's always severe. We have to recognize that in some situations the harm that could be done is experienced as more severe than in other times.
I think that it's really important in governance contexts where people may have to think about it. And so if trust always has to involve vulnerability, then trust can involve governance targets. You don't quite go all the way into the hard argument. There needs to be something there, even when it's not felt as being so severe. I'm afraid it's just a semantic.
I'm gonna think about
we're going to draw this over here versus draw it over here.
Okay.
So thank you. Dominic Sommer next, please. And then no, this is related. Oh, sorry, thank you. Sorry, Dominic, 1 second. We have another comment related to what we just discussed. Michael, please. Yeah.
Maybe I'm completely wrong or off whatsoever. At least in marketing, there's a huge distinction between these two dimensions. I mean, just consider, I don't know, toothpaste. I tell you that my toothpaste is much better than my competitor's toothpaste. So there is some vulnerability because you cannot really assess if I'm right or wrong, but the severity is really low. On the other hand, if I think of financial products, you cannot tell if my Vista plan is much broad. So long-term plan for retirement or for a 1K plan is much better than the competitor's plan, but this would have a huge impact on your financial welfare. So at least in marketing, it's really common to use them as a distinct measures for in order to, for example, we wouldn't call it trust, we call it credibility.
Yeah.
So we talk about branding. So I just recognize that many points that were discussed today are also topics in marketing that I teach my students in my lectures on customer relationship management. So and at least we did have this distinction.
Yeah, and I think it makes sense, but maybe it's also just my personal feeling that I wouldn't talk about being vulnerable in the context of toothpaste, right? Maybe I would just give it a different word.
Let's call it cream against wrinkles.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Oh, that's.
We've backed up against that and trying to build measures. Because how do you say, how vulnerable do you feel to someone who doesn't feel vulnerable?
Yeah.
Yes.
Interesting. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And now over to Dominic.
Okay, first, thanks for the interesting talk, Joe. And I think what I got stuck with is somehow related to the last comments, because during your talk in the model, I was wondering in how far your three established vulnerability dimensions are different or related to risk perceptions, or maybe also actual risk, objective risk, because as far as I understand it, you're kind of adding to the Mayer et al. Model, and there you would have risk positioned, but in your model there is no risk. So I was wondering how you would relate those different constructs.
So risk in Mayer's model is once you've decided how willing you are to accept vulnerability, how big is the risk that's actually attached to it, and then that moderates your relationship with cooperation. And I'd argue that we're talking about a bit of a different thing, that is the other person can make. This is not going to be a good answer. It's the vulnerability that I would be accepting by trusting, not the risk I would be taking by cooperating, if that makes any sense. So it's what it has to precede trust itself, because it's the thing you're accepting. So they may be very similar, they may be very correlated, they may be that if you're in a relationship where trusting someone else means taking a risk with them and cooperating, that I can see how those become very, very, very similar and very attached to each other. But what matters is not, when we're talking about vulnerability for the sake of this paper, what matters is not the risk that you take by cooperating. It's the vulnerability that you are accepting when you feel trust for that person. It should be broader. It should be less specific. It should be more about the many things that could happen in the context of that specific domain of that relationship, in a way that the risk in Mayer's model should be more quantifiable. It should be more, if I do this specific thing, what could go wrong for me? So they're going to be similar, and because of that, I say this isn't the answer. But it's a different thing we're asking than what he is.
Okay. So, Michael, I see your hand is up, but first we have Simone to I can see him.
Okay, so thank you very much. This was a very interesting talk to me, particularly being a sociologist, so it's a bit far away of what my thinking is, but very interesting. So, but this is also my question, which somehow also builds on what have been asked by Jeffrey before. So, so the trust in the global economy, trust in economical models like capitalism, trust in the state. So can we apply this concept of vulnerability in any way to understand these kinds of trust? So trust not in that is interpersonal, related to particular relations, but trust in something like broader institutions and society.
You're going to hear the psychologist in me in my response. But to the extent that we anthropomorphize them. And so if we think of them as having agency and having the ability to make decisions and being able to determine whether or not there is, then it makes a lot of sense to think of it in terms of this trust relationship. And so if going into a context that I just know a little bit better, if it's a matter of trusting the police versus trusting Officer Steve versus trusting Commander Smith, when you get to the point where you have that level of specificity, you really may not make any sense to talk anymore about trust in the police department. Because the question is then who is making these decisions? Who is it that I trust or don't trust? And I imagine there are some people in a place to talk about abstract systems in a way that really pulls them apart and says, what are you actually talking about? But I would argue that for at least some of society, the idea of the market or the system or the economy is something that can be taken as very much an agentic thing. That it's a thing that makes decisions, a thing that makes choices, and those choices impact my own. And if that is what's going on in someone's mind, then I do think it makes sense to use these kinds of models. If people are breaking them out into a lot of different things that have individual moving pieces, then I think your referent needs to become more specific. That when you say, do you trust the market, you really need to be talking about what part of it you mean and what decisions that individual actor or group or institution is making.
Thank you, Simone. And back to the online audience. Michael, please.
Yes, sorry, I am still thinking with you about this problematic feature vulnerability. So yeah, I was wondering, yeah, so where in the model, I mean, so you talk about the severity of the vulnerability, and I was wondering if somewhere you also talk about the different qualities of vulnerability, or if this is a problem at all, because let's say if I'm an investor and I put all my stakes, all my money, my house, I don't know, in one thing, and I make myself and my whole family very vulnerable, but it's all part of a risk assessment that I'm making. This, and I compare this to someone, you know, who trusts his wife, basically that she's honest. But let's say in 10 years he finds out that the only thing she did is lie to him, and she has a double life. I'm trying to find out. So the one point, I'm risking my whole family, my whole house, my whole livelihood, everything, which is big, which is, the other thing seems like a very small type of vulnerability, but the lie can totally change my entire feeling of what humanity is all about. And you know what I mean? I still have my home, I'm gonna live. So I was wondering the quality of the vulnerability, if you're talking about this, or if it's just about the quantity. And yeah, and one side note, I'm still not getting over this whole idea that, you know, if you're in a trusting relationship, the vulnerability is not the problem, right? I mean, isn't this exactly that you've come over, this is the thing that you're not thinking about, but yeah, will be forever a problem that it's not. Yeah.
No, I totally get it.
I just wanted to reinforce maybe that point, because I think that's really one of the most difficult things to also operationalize in research is that the people who are trusting strongly don't feel the vulnerability. They don't, well, they might still be aware that in principle they still can be hurt, but they don't expect to be hurt. I said, like, when you trust, you don't expect to be hurt, and that's why the vulnerability is not a problem. But at the same time, we argue that we still need to understand what kind of vulnerability in principle is in the background of the relationship. So, yeah, Joe, how do we fix that?
Couple thoughts for the first part of your question. I think that this is where it gets really, really important, that you were talking about this vulnerability that a person is conceptualizing or is thinking about in this space of uncertainty prior to this knowledge or this information they might have later. So where you were talking about the husband trusts his wife and then later finds out that things are very different. The finding out later is not a part of the trust that was part of the original conversation. It becomes something different in the future. But what we're really talking about is in the space of this uncertainty, with not knowing how this relationship is going to go, not knowing what's going to happen in the future. Trust is about the recognition of vulnerability and the acceptance of it, or the willingness to accept it. And so it really we're not talking about the world of risk. We're not talking about the world of things that could go wrong. We're not talking about a concrete assessment that you can make after you feel trusting and something else happens. We really are talking about the thing that at least conceptually precedes trust. I think this comes back to the earlier question we got, that in a relationship, it's much more dynamic, that there is much more going on. You have this, they do, I think, I evaluate, I feel they do kind of interaction. But what we're really trying to focus on here is at least a first step in this process, is that in the space where someone is trying to determine whether or not they're willing to accept vulnerability to someone else, whether or not they trust them, there's uncertainty about how they would be interacted with and some potential for harm. And that is the vulnerability we're talking about.
Okay, so there are further questions here.
There was one
in the room. Yeah, I mean in the room first of all, but just to see the not. And so then back to Frank. A little bit shorter this time, please, Frank. But we're glad that you have another comment. Thank you.
Of course, it's going to be much shorter, and thank you for your patience the other time. So yeah, it's a really interesting question, and what you raised, Guido, that it's not exactly the vulnerability in the truster, but the background is what's interesting. I think to understand that, we might really want to look into those literature that go beyond the perception level, the perceived vulnerability, and on the cognitive level, go beyond and deeper. That's what my comment is. It's not a question. I would just like urge you or advise, if I may be so bold. It might be interesting for you. Thank you.
That would be great. There was a question in the chat from Audrey that I didn't want to miss since it's getting. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. The question was, wouldn't risk be the reason for vulnerability? For example, in the picture, the risk of falling makes the person vulnerable, or are they being conflated? And no, that is why. The reason that the person is vulnerable is because they're at some risk of injury. But what we're trying to make sure that we drive a wedge between is the difference between an objectively accessible probability of harm and the subjective experience of that risk. And so someone asked earlier about the distinction between perceived risk from the risk literature and how we're using that here. It really is about the experience of that risk that we're talking. It's not about the objective outside thing.
So thank you very much, Joe. I think we're going to come to a close soon. It was a very interesting discussion, and the praise for your presentation, I don't need to repeat, but one well done. I would like to invite everybody in the room here, of course, but also those of you online who are maybe not too far away, because I'm very happy to see people from almost all around the world attending this evening. But let's say if you're in Europe, Joe is still going to be here in Germany until about Christmas time. And maybe if you have the possibility to travel, or if you just want a Zoom chat in the same time zone with Joe, please get in touch. I know he'd be keen to meet trust researchers and also on a one-to-one basis during his stay in Germany. So thank you for joining us online this evening. These online research seminars that were online last semester that are now hybrid are, of course, a regular feature of what our institute is organizing, but not always on trust research. Last semester, we had Anne Gausta talking about trust in networks. But our next talk will be about multi-stakeholder initiatives and how they are affected actually by legislative changes, so that when certain kind of hard law measures are taken, what does that mean for people who are engaged in all kinds of initiatives in the, let's call it, soft law sector? And Leona Henry from our institute will present current research together with Eva van der Zee, who's at the University of Hamburg. And this will be also a hybrid event, so you can join on campus here in Witten or online. Just send us a message and we'll send you the link. So 15th of November, Monday afternoon, I guess. I think it's at 4 o'clock already, right?
4:30, yeah.
Let me just check it. Yes, 4:30. It's this one starts. Great. So once again, thank you to Joe, to everybody online, to everybody here in the room. It was a big pleasure, and we'll hope to see each other soon in an online setting or hopefully offline as well. All the best and have a great evening. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.